1870, a black cavalry trumpeter blew recall before a massacre and saved 17 lives, then was court-martialed for retreat without orders. And I still keep that story folded in the back of my wallet like it's a lucky charm or a blueprint for how to ruin your life by doing the right thing. I'm not a historian, and I sure as hell wasn't there in the 19th century, but when you spend enough time sitting in the dark, you start looking for people who understood that there's a difference between following the chain of command and actually saving the men breathing right next to you. I was 19 when I enlisted, living in a town in Ohio where the biggest thing that ever happened was the high school football team making the regional playoffs every 5 years. My life was defined by the smell of damp grass on Friday nights, the way my mom's kitchen always smelled like burnt coffee and pine sol, and the girl, Sarah, who sat 3 rows behind me in history class and made me feel like I was actually capable of something beyond working at the local Radiator shop. I didn't join because I had some grand vision of the world. I joined because I was tired of staring at the same 4 walls of that shop and wondering if the dust on my boots was the only thing I'd ever collect. I wanted something that felt bigger than a hometown, something that required a version of me I hadn't met yet. I thought about that trumpeter a lot, not then, when I signed the papers, but later, when the air started tasting like diesel and bad decisions. I thought about how it feels to know exactly what the right thing is, and knowing that everyone around you is going to call it a mistake until the day you die. My dad drove me to the recruitment office in his old Ford, the one with the cracked windshield that he refused to fix because he said it gave the truck character. We didn't talk much on the way there. He just kept tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, rhythmic and steady, like a clock counting down. When we got to the curb, he didn't give me a lecture about honor or duty. He just looked at me, his eyes tired the way men's eyes get when they've worked 40 years for a company that doesn't know their middle name, and he said, "Keep your head down and your ears open. And for the love of God, don't be the hero unless you're prepared to be the one who gets blamed for it." I laughed then. I thought it was just the old man being cynical. I didn't know that 3 years later, I'd be replaying those words in my head while trying to scrub a stain off my boots that wouldn't come out no matter how much soap I used. Basic training was a blur of noise and sweat, and people screaming at me until I couldn't remember my own middle name. It was the kind of environment where you don't really exist as a person. You exist as a component. You wake up when you're told, you eat what you're fed, and you run until your lungs feel like they're filled with broken glass. But there was a weird, distorted kind of joy in it too. We were all in the same boat, all equally miserable, and that created a bond that felt stronger than anything I'd ever had back in Ohio. I remember Miller, this kid from South Carolina who could sleep anywhere, sitting up, standing in formation, even while we were marching if he really tried hard enough. He was the one who kept us sane. He had this way of making us laugh when we were at our absolute breaking point, usually by making some incredibly inappropriate comment about the drill sergeant's haircut. We'd be standing there, terrified and exhausted, and he'd whisper something so ridiculous that I'd have to bite my tongue until I tasted copper just to keep from cracking a smile. We were kids. We were barely adults, acting like we were part of some grand machine, and for a while, it felt like the most important thing in the world. Then the deployment orders came down, and the reality of it hit like a physical weight. We were headed over to a place where the sun felt like it wanted to peel the skin right off your back. The transition was so fast it gave me whiplash. One week, I was eating a lukewarm hamburger at a diner in the middle of nowhere, wondering if I should call Sarah, and the next week I was sitting on a transport plane with 100 other guys, all of us staring at the floor, not saying a word. The hum of the engines was so loud it vibrated in your teeth. I remember looking at my hands and thinking they didn't look like a soldier's hands yet. They looked like the hands of a kid who worked on radiators. I reached into my pocket and touched the corner of the folded printout I'd made about that cavalry trumpeter, a little talisman I'd printed at the library before I left. It was stupid, I know. But when you're about to walk into a place where the ground might not be there when you wake up, you hold onto whatever keeps you feeling like a human being instead of a target. Arrival was a sensory overload that never really went away. The heat was thick, almost oily, and it carried the smell of burning trash and something else, something metallic, like dried blood and old copper. The FOB felt like a cage, a fenced-in box of gravel and HESCO barriers that looked like something out of a bad dream. We spent our first week just getting acclimated, which is a nice way of saying we spent 7 days sweating through our clothes and trying to figure out which end of the base was the safest. I remember the first time I went out on a patrol. It wasn't even a mission, it was just a route clearance, a simple drive down a road that looked like it had been carved out of the moon. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every pile of trash on the side of the road looked like a hidden bomb. You're scanning everything, your eyes burning, your heart hammering against your ribs, and the silence is worse than the noise because it means something is waiting for you to make a mistake. The camaraderie back at the FOB was the only thing that felt real. We'd sit in the chow hall, eating that god-awful powdered eggs and lukewarm coffee, and talk about the dumbest things. Miller would tell stories about his life back home that I'm 80% sure he made up on the spot, but we'd laugh anyway because it was a break from the constant, low-level hum of anxiety. We started to form a shorthand, a way of speaking that didn't require words. A look could mean we need to move, or this place feels wrong, or I'm terrified. You get to know the men around you better than you know your own family. You know who chews their fingernails when they're nervous, who prays, who stares at the horizon for hours, and who talks to their kid's photo like the kid can actually hear them. There was this one night a month in, when we were sitting on the edge of the perimeter, smoking cigarettes and watching the stars. They were clearer there than they ever were back home, brilliant and cold, and completely indifferent to what we were doing. Miller looked at me and said, "You ever think about what happens when this is all over?" I told him I didn't want to jinx it by thinking too far ahead. He just nodded, flicked his cigarette butt into the gravel, and said, "I'm gonna buy a boat. A big, ugly boat with a decent cooler, and I'm never gonna be anywhere where I can't see the ocean." I laughed and told him he'd get seasick the second he hit the dock, and we sat there for an hour, just trading insults and talking about the future like it was a promise instead of a gamble. It was one of those moments that felt like it would last forever, even though I knew, deep down, that the clock was ticking. But the tension never really left. It just evolved. It turned into a physical presence, like an extra piece of gear I had to carry everywhere. Every time we went out, I felt it tightening around my chest. We started seeing things, not just the enemy, but the people who lived there, caught in the middle of a mess that wasn't of their making. You'd see a kid standing in a doorway, eyes wide and hollow, and it would tear you apart because you knew you were part of the reason their world was turning upside down. You couldn't fix it. You couldn't talk to them. You just had to keep driving, keep scanning, keep your weapon at the ready, and pray that you didn't have to be the one who caused more damage. There was a specific patrol near the end of our first quarter that I still dream about. We were moving through a narrow alleyway in a village that felt like it had been abandoned years ago. The walls were sun-bleached concrete, crumbling at the edges, and the air was still, too still. I was walking point, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack a rib. Every sound, a shifting brick, a stray cat, the rustle of a curtain, felt like a gunshot. My sergeant, a guy named Henderson who was usually a rock, looked back at me and his face was pale. He didn't say anything, but he held up his hand, signaling us to stop. We froze in place. I could hear Miller breathing behind me, shallow and uneven. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. I remember looking at a patch of weeds growing out of a crack in the wall, thinking how strange it was that something could grow in a place so devoid of life. It felt like an omen. The reports we got later that night were conflicting, and honestly, none of them made any sense. There were rumors of an ambush, rumors of a trap, rumors of something far worse that nobody wanted to talk about. The command structure wanted numbers, wanted results, wanted to know why we hadn't pushed further. They didn't see the alley. They didn't feel the air. They just saw a map with red pins on it. We were back at the FOB, sitting in the silence of our shared quarters, and nobody was joking. Miller was sitting on his cot, cleaning his rifle for the third time that evening, his movements mechanical and precise. I looked at him, wanting to say something, anything, but the words felt like lead in my mouth. I didn't know then that we were standing on the edge of a precipice, that the next few weeks would strip away everything I thought I knew about bravery and duty. I remember thinking about that black Trumpeter again. I pulled the printout out of my wallet. The paper was soft and worn at the edges, and I read it again, the words blurred by the dim light of the lantern. 1870. The year was so far away it felt like a fable, but the feeling behind the story, the feeling of being trapped between a direct order and a moral choice, that felt like it was happening right then in real time. Henderson walked in, his face drawn tight, and he looked at the lot of us. He didn't wait for us to ask. He just said, "We're heading back out at 0400. Not for the same route, something different, something heavier." The way he said it, he didn't look at any of us. He stared at the center of the room, like he was looking at something that wasn't there. I could feel the atmosphere shift in the room, the sudden drop in temperature. I knew then that we were being sent into something that wasn't going to be cleared up with a routine patrol. It was a mission that felt like an ending, even before we'd even put our boots on. I looked at Miller and he finally stopped cleaning his rifle. He looked up at me, and for the first time since we'd landed, I saw fear. Not the kind of fear that makes you run, the kind of fear that makes you realize you're already out of time. He didn't say anything, just reached out and patted the air between us, a gesture that was supposed to be comforting but felt like a goodbye. We sat in the dark for a long time, the only sound the hum of the generator outside, and the rhythmic, hollow clicking of metal against metal as Henderson checked his gear. I felt a cold knot tighten in my gut. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the morning was going to be the last one where we were all the same. The morning came not with a sun-bleached dawn, but with a gray, suffocating film that seemed to press the heat down into the gravel of the yard. By 0330, the air inside the barracks was thick with the scent of stale sweat and the heavy, metallic tang of gun oil. We didn't talk. There was no joking, no ribbing about haircuts, no tall tales about boats in the Pacific. We moved with the dull, rhythmic clatter of grown men putting on heavy suits of armor, each piece of gear feeling heavier than it had the day before. I watched Miller fumble with his hydration tube, his fingers thick and clumsy in the dark, and I reached over to guide it into his vest. He didn't look at me. He just gave a short, sharp nod that felt like a secret pact. That was the last time he looked at me like a friend. From that point on, we were just bodies in a line, waiting for the sky to fall. We loaded into the Humvees with the kind of practiced, silent efficiency that only comes when your subconscious has taken over the steering wheel. The convoy started with a jerk, the engine whine rising to a scream as we peeled out from behind the wire. The darkness outside was absolute, a void that felt like it was breathing. We hit the main supply route, and the world narrowed down to the narrow, flickering beam of the lead vehicle's headlights. I was in the gunner's seat, the wind whipping against my face with a grit that tasted like pulverized stone and ancient salt. My hands were clamped onto the mounting so tight my knuckles felt like they might snap, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about my mother's kitchen back in Ohio, the specific way the light hit the linoleum floor around noon, and the way the screen door would whine on its hinges every single time. It was a stupid, mundane memory, but I held onto it like a lifeline because everything in the present was dissolving into the black. The turnoff came around 0515, a jagged cut into the desert floor that wasn't on any of the maps we'd been briefed on. The lead truck signaled, and we veered off, the terrain immediately turning treacherous. It was nothing but craters and washouts, the vehicle bucking like a wild animal. Then the radio cut out. Not a static fade, but a clean, sudden silence that was louder than the engine. Henderson, sitting in the passenger seat, turned his head slowly to look at me, his eyes wide and vacant. He didn't say a word, just pointed forward. 100 yards ahead, the road just stopped. It didn't wash away. It vanished into a depression that looked like a jagged, open mouth in the crust of the earth. We piled out, the transition from the claustrophobic hum of the vehicle to the open, howling silence of the desert feeling like a slap to the face. We fanned out, our boots crunching on the dry earth, every movement cautious and strained. The sun was starting to peek over the jagged ridges in the distance, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping fingers. Miller was 10 feet to my left, his rifle shouldered, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. He looked like he was about to say something. He even opened his mouth, maybe to make a crack about how lost we were, but then the air changed. It didn't vibrate, it bruised. It was a shift in pressure that you feel in your inner ear, a heavy, sickening pull that made my knees buckle for a split second. The ground erupted. It wasn't one blast, it was a cascade of thunder that seemed to come from underneath our own feet. I was thrown backward, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of brown dust and searing orange light. I landed hard, the air driven from my lungs, and for a few seconds there was nothing but the sound of rushing blood in my ears. I tried to gasp, but my throat was packed with dust. I rolled over, my hands scrambling for my weapon, but my rifle was gone. I looked to my left. Where Miller had been standing, there was only a crater, a jagged hole that looked like it had been punched through the floor of the world. My brain wouldn't register it. I stood up, my legs shaking, and screamed his name. It sounded thin, pathetic, just a weak scratch against the roar of the fire that had started to crawl along the edge of the blast zone. The heat was immense, a wall of pure energy that made the air shimmer. I started running toward the crater, my boots sliding on the shifting, unstable soil. Henderson was already there, or what was left of his group, huddled behind a piece of twisted metal that had once been a vehicle door. Nobody was firing back, there was nothing to fire at. The enemy was the landscape itself, the hidden, waiting malice of the road. I dropped to my knees at the edge of the hole. I didn't see Miller. I saw pieces. I saw the yellow stripe of his name tag, bright and clean against the scorched gray earth, and my mind just snapped. I started clawing at the dirt, my fingernails tearing until they bled, trying to pull the world back together. Henderson grabbed me from behind, his hands locking onto my harness like a vice. I fought him, I screamed at him. I told him to let go, but he just held me there, his own face a mask of frozen, hollow grief. He was weeping, silent, heaving sobs that didn't make a sound, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. The toughest man I'd ever known was breaking into pieces in front of me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The sky began to fill with the sound of rotors, a distant thrum that grew until it was all-consuming. But it didn't feel like rescue. It felt like a funeral shroud. I stopped digging. My hands were raw, caked in grit and blood that wasn't mine, and I just sat there. The world was moving again. The medevac teams were moving. The other squads were securing the perimeter. People were shouting orders that meant absolutely nothing, but I was still. I was sitting at the edge of that hole, watching the sun hit the yellow plastic of that name tag. It seemed impossible that the sun could still shine on a place like this. It seemed like a crime. I couldn't feel my fingers. I couldn't feel my feet. I was just a shell, sitting in the middle of a war zone, feeling the profound, crushing weight of being the one who was left standing. A medic came over, a kid with eyes that looked like they were 100 years old, and he tried to move me. I shoved him away. I didn't want to leave. If I left, this would be over. And if this was over, then Miller was gone. And if Miller was gone, then the version of me that laughed at his jokes in the chow hall was gone too. I stayed there until the heat grew so intense I felt like I was going to melt into the ground. The rest of the day is a series of static images in my mind, like frames of a film that's been left out in the rain. I remember the smell of burnt plastic and copper. I remember the way the dust settled on everything, turning the whole world a uniform, ugly shade of gray. I remember watching someone pick up the name tag. They didn't hand it to me. They put it in a small white plastic bag, and the sound of the zipper *zip** sounded like a final, absolute sentence. I didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the day. I didn't drink. I didn't eat. I just stared at the horizon, waiting for the sky to apologize, which of course it never did. We were loaded onto a transport truck just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. The ride back to the FOB was silent, the kind of silence that has teeth. Every bump in the road felt like we were driving over something we shouldn't have been. I kept looking at the floorboards, expecting to see Miller's boots, expecting him to crack a joke about the terrible suspension. But the seat next to me was empty. It was just an empty piece of metal, vibrating with the engine, mocking the fact that I was still sitting in it. When we pulled back through the gate, the base looked the same, but it was a different world. The lights were on in the chow hall, people were laughing in the distance, and I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hatred for them. How could they be laughing? How could the coffee still be brewing? How could the world just keep spinning when a piece of it had been torn out and discarded in a hole in the dirt? I walked past them, past the mess hall, past the barracks, and went to the edge of the perimeter fence where we had sat smoking a few weeks ago. The moon was out, cold and bright, and it looked exactly the same as it had back in Ohio. That was the most painful part, the indifference of the universe. I reached into my pocket and touched the worn printout of the Trumpeter story. It felt like trash. It felt like a lie. I realized then that the Trumpeter didn't save those men. He just delayed their end so he could be the one to carry the guilt. I stood there for hours, the metal of the fence cold against my back, listening to the generator hum and the distant, muffled sound of a radio playing a song I didn't recognize. I thought about Sarah, and I realized I couldn't even remember the color of her eyes. The image of the yellow name tag had wiped everything else out, replaced every memory, every hope, every dream with a single searing point of loss. I didn't go back to the barracks. I just stood there watching the perimeter guards, feeling like a ghost. I was alive, but I wasn't present. A part of me had stayed back there in that crater, and I knew with a terrifying clarity that I would never get it back. The war wasn't a mission anymore. It wasn't a test of character. It was a slow, methodical erasure. Every day, a little more of you gets stripped away, ground down by the heat and the fear and the sheer, unending horror of it all, until there's nothing left but the urge to survive and the crushing, suffocating weight of everything you failed to save. Henderson found me around 0200. He didn't ask me to come in. He just stood a few feet away, leaning against the fence, his silhouette a dark, jagged shape against the stars. He lit a cigarette and handed it to me. I took it, my hand shaking, and the first drag felt like fire in my lungs. He didn't say a word about what happened. He didn't talk about the tactical situation or the reports or the command. He just stood there, breathing out smoke, his face obscured by the darkness. He knew that there weren't any words that could fix this. He knew that the only thing left to do was to stand in the dark and wait for the sun to rise so we could go out and do it all over again. I looked at him, and for a second I saw his soul. It was hollow, just like mine. We were two dead men who were still moving, still breathing, still obeying orders because we didn't know how to do anything else. He looked at me, and I saw the recognition there, the look of two people who have stared into the abyss and realized that the abyss was looking back, and that it had decided we weren't worth taking yet. He turned and walked away, back toward the barracks, and I stayed there. I stayed there until my cigarette burned down to the filter, until my fingers were singed, until the first hint of gray light began to bleed into the eastern sky. I had to go back in. I had to face the room. I had to face the empty cot where Miller had been, with his clean clothes and his photos and his stupid imaginary boat. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of sand and diesel, and turned toward the barracks. I felt like I was walking toward a gallows. I knew what was waiting for me: the silence, the empty space, the knowledge that I had failed the only thing that mattered. But I kept walking. I moved one foot in front of the other, my boots heavy, my heart a stone in my chest, and I walked back into the hell we had built for ourselves. The door to the barracks was open. Inside it was quiet, the only sound the soft, rhythmic breathing of the men who had managed to fall asleep. I walked to my cot and sat down, the frame groaning under my weight. I looked over at Miller's cot. It was perfectly made. It looked like he had never been there at all. That was the most horrible thing of all, the way the world erases you. He was gone, he was vaporized, and here was his bed, waiting for someone else, waiting to be used by some other kid who didn't know what was coming. I stared at the empty space, my eyes burning, and I felt the first real tear I'd shed since I was 10. It didn't bring relief. It just brought more pain, a cold, sharp realization that the grief was only the beginning. I lay down, my uniform still caked in the dust of the blast site, and I stared at the ceiling. I knew I wouldn't sleep. The second I closed my eyes, I would be back in that crater. I would be reaching into the dirt. I would be seeing the yellow tag again. So I stayed awake, staring into the dark, feeling the hours stretch out before me like a desert. I thought about the phone calls I'd have to make. I thought about the letters I'd have to write. How do you tell a mother that her son is gone and that you were standing 10 feet away and you couldn't do a damn thing about it? How do you put that into words without screaming? How do you live with that? I closed my eyes for a second, just a second, and I was back there. The roar, the heat, the feeling of the earth shifting under my boots. I jerked awake, my heart hammering, my hands clawing at the sheets. The room was still there. The quiet was still there, but the fear had settled in, deep in my bones like marrow. It wasn't going anywhere. It was going to be my shadow, my passenger, my partner for the rest of my life. I realized then that I wasn't just grieving for Miller. I was grieving for myself. I was grieving for the kid who had left Ohio with a head full of dreams and a heart full of hope. That kid was dead. He had died in that hole, and in his place was this empty, broken thing that didn't know how to be a person anymore. The dawn was coming. I could see the light shifting, the shadows lengthening across the floor. In an hour, the wake-up call would sound. In 2 hours, we'd be back in the Humvees. In 3 hours, we'd be out on the road again, looking for ghosts. And I would go. I would get in the truck. I would pick up my rifle. I would do what I was told because that was all I knew how to do. I was a component of a machine, a cog in a gear, a number in a report. I wasn't a man. I wasn't a friend. I was a survivor, and that was the cruelest irony of all. I sat up, the springs of the cot biting into my back, and I looked at my hands. They were trembling. I made a fist trying to force them to stop, but the tremor was deep, a vibration that seemed to come from the very center of my nervous system. I thought about the trumpeter one more time. I wondered if he had sat in the dark like this, wondering if he'd done the right thing, wondering if the cost was worth the life he'd saved. But there was no answer. There was never an answer. There was only the duty and the silence and the long, slow process of waiting for the end. I stood up and walked to the small, cracked mirror by the door. I looked at my reflection, and I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. The eyes were older, the skin drawn, the expression one of absolute, hollow exhaustion. I looked like a man who had seen the end of the world and was surprised to find it still spinning. I touched my face, tracing the lines of dust and grime, and I saw the fear in my own eyes, reflecting back at me, a mirror of my own internal collapse. I looked away. I couldn't bear to see it anymore. The alarm clock on the shelf started to tick, a soft, insistent sound that marked the passage of time toward the morning. I sat down on the edge of the cot and waited. I waited for the noise to start, for the bass to wake up, for the machine to begin its work again. I waited, and with every tick of the clock, I felt the gap between who I was and who I had become widen into a canyon. I was lost. I was completely, utterly lost, and there was no map, no compass, no guide to help me find my way back to the world of the living. I closed my eyes and tried to remember Sarah's voice. I tried to hear her laugh, to remember the specific way she said my name. But all I could hear was the roar of the blast, the sound of the metal tearing, the scream of the wind over the desert. The silence was absolute. I was in a place where love didn't exist, where connection was a liability, where the only thing that mattered was the next 4 seconds, and I was terrified. I was terrified of what would happen if I finally let go, if I finally stopped pretending that I could handle this, if I finally admitted that I was broken beyond repair. But I wouldn't stop. I couldn't stop. I was trapped in the machinery, and I would keep turning, I would keep moving, I would keep surviving because there was no other way out. I was a soldier, a patriot, a ghost, and this was my life now. I sat in the dark, the ticking of the clock, the only thing keeping me connected to reality, and I waited for the sun to rise on a day that I already knew would be the worst of my life. I was waiting for the end, but the end was nowhere in sight, and I had a long, long road to travel before I could even hope for a moment of peace. I heard the first footsteps in the hallway outside. It was time. I stood up, my joints aching, my body stiff and cold. I reached for my gear, the familiar weight of it a comfort even as it reminded me of what I had lost. I pulled on my boots, laced them tight, and took one last look at the empty cot. Then, without a sound, I walked out of the room into the hallway and toward the light of the morning. I was going back to the war, back to the fire, back to the place where I had lost my soul, and I knew that whatever happened next, I would have to carry it all alone in the silence of my own heart. The yard was beginning to fill with the sound of engines. The smell of diesel and sand was everywhere, a cloying, heavy scent that promised nothing but more of the same. I walked toward our vehicle, my eyes fixed on the gravel in front of my boots. I didn't look at the others. I didn't want to see the pity in their faces, or the fear, or the emptiness. I just wanted to get into the truck, to close the door, to shut out the world and wait for the chaos to begin again. I was a ghost among ghosts, a machine among machines, and this was the reality of my existence. As I climbed into the gunner's seat, I felt the familiar, heavy weight of the weapon in my hands. It was the only thing that felt real. It was a tool of destruction, a machine for ending lives, but it was also my only protection, my only connection to the world I had been forced to enter. I gripped the handles, my fingers finding their place with an ease that horrified me. I was good at this. I was efficient, I was focused, I was lethal, and I hated myself for it. I hated the fact that I had adapted so quickly, that I had become what they needed me to be, that I had traded my humanity for the ability to survive in a place where humanity was the first thing to be discarded. The convoy began to move. We rolled out of the gate, the wire fence shrinking behind us, the world of the FOB disappearing in a cloud of dust. We hit the main road, the hum of the engine a constant, low-frequency roar that vibrated through my body. The landscape was a blur of brown and gray, the mountains in the distance shimmering in the morning heat. We were on patrol again, a small, fragile line of steel moving through a vast, indifferent desert, and I was on point, the first one to see what was coming, the first one to react, the first one to die. I scanned the horizon, my eyes burning, my nerves raw. Every shadow was a threat, every pile of trash a potential bomb, every movement a sign of hidden, waiting eyes. I was on the edge, a wire pulled tight until it was ready to snap, and I knew that if I didn't find a way to manage the pressure, it would tear me apart. But there was no time for management. There was only the road and the mission and the constant, relentless demand of the present. I held my breath, I tightened my grip, and I stared into the void, waiting for the world to explode again. We hit the sector where we had been the day before, and the tension in the vehicle skyrocketed. You could feel it in the air, the sudden, sharp change in the atmosphere, the way the driver tensed his hands on the wheel, the way Henderson stopped talking. We were back at the scene of the trauma, back at the place where the earth had opened up and swallowed our friends. I searched the area, my eyes darting from side to side, looking for any sign of what had caused the disaster, but there was nothing. It was just an empty stretch of road, a desolate, barren patch of ground that felt haunted by the presence of the dead. I looked at the hole in the ground. It was already starting to fill in, the sand and wind conspiring to hide the scar we had left behind. In a few days, it would be gone, smoothed over as if it had never happened. And that was the horror of it, the way the world moved on, the way it covered up the wounds, the way it pretended that the loss was just a footnote in a larger, incomprehensible story. I felt a surge of rage, a hot, bright flare of anger that I wanted to burn everything down, to force the world to acknowledge what had happened, to make it stop and look at the ruin it had created. But I didn't scream, I didn't fire, I didn't move. I just sat there in the gunner's seat, watching the road unfold in front of us, a ribbon of dirt leading toward an unknown, uncertain future. I was a prisoner of the mission, a slave to the cycle of violence that had become my life. And I knew that there was no way out, no path back to the person I had been, no road that would lead me home to the life I had left behind in Ohio. I was here in the fire, and this was where I would stay until the end. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, a winding, broken line disappearing into the shimmering haze of the horizon. We kept moving, our vehicles kicking up a wake of dust that hung in the air like a ghost. I felt the weight of the rifle, the heavy, metallic presence of it in my hands, a constant reminder of the burden I was carrying. I thought about Miller, about the boat he had dreamed of, about the life he would never have. I thought about the families back home, the letters they would receive, the hollow, meaningless apologies they would be forced to accept. And I felt a profound, aching sorrow, a grief so heavy it threatened to crush me from the inside out. I forced myself to breathe, to focus, to do my job. I was a professional, a trained, efficient, lethal professional, and that was all I had left. I looked at the desert, the ancient, uncaring beauty of it, and I realized that it had won. It had consumed us, it had broken us, it had turned us into the things we feared most. And there was nothing I could do to change it. There was nothing I could do to fix it. There was only the road and the silence and the long, slow, agonizing work of enduring the unendurable. We reached a turn, a sharp, narrow bend that led toward the village, and the convoy slowed. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, a primal, instinctive warning that triggered a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. Something was wrong. The silence wasn't the usual heavy quiet of the desert. It was a watchful, predatory stillness that made my skin crawl. I signaled to the driver, but he had already seen it. He hit the brakes, the vehicle skidding in the loose sand, and we came to a stop in the middle of the road. I stood up, my eyes sweeping the area, my finger hovering over the safety. There was a car parked by the side of the road, a rusted, abandoned wreck that looked like it had been there for years. But the tires were new. They were black, clean, and entirely out of place in the ancient dust of the desert. I felt the trap close around us, the sudden, sharp realization that we had walked right into it, that we were exactly where they wanted us to be. I started to yell to warn the others, but the air suddenly felt heavy, dense, and suffocating. And then the world went white. Not a bright, clean white, but a harsh, blinding, incandescent flare that seemed to consume the sky. The blast wasn't a sound, it was a physical force, a wall of pure energy that slammed into us with the weight of a freight train. My consciousness shattered. I felt the vehicle buckle, the metal groaning as it was torn apart, the ground rushing up to meet us. Everything turned into a kaleidoscope of fire and steel, a chaotic, swirling vortex of noise and destruction. And then there was nothing. Only the silence of the void and the cold, dark, terrifying certainty that I was finally at the end of the road. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was a high-pitched, electric hum that lived inside my skull, a tinnitus that drowned out the world until only the heavy, rhythmic thud of my own heart remained. I didn't open my eyes at first because I was afraid of what I might see. I was lying on something hard and jagged, the taste of burnt rubber and copper coating my tongue. And for a moment, I didn't know if I was alive or just a memory caught in the loop of the blast. Then the smell hit me, that specific, sickening scent of ionized air and shredded earth. I opened my eyes, and the sky was a bruised purple, the sun finally sinking below the horizon. The Humvee was a twisted ribcage of metal, its chassis groaned as it settled into the dirt, and all around me the desert had gone unnaturally still. I reached up to my chest. My gear was half torn away, my breath coming in shallow, frantic stabs. I rolled onto my side and saw Henderson 10 feet away. He was sitting up, staring at his hands with a vacant, terrifying curiosity. He wasn't bleeding, not that I could see, but he was gone. The person who had stood with me in the dark by the fence just hours ago, the one who had offered me that last cigarette, he wasn't in those eyes anymore. I crawled toward him, my limbs feeling like they belonged to someone else, heavy and disconnected. I grabbed his shoulder and he didn't even flinch. He just looked at me, a slow, hollow blink, and whispered something I couldn't catch. I leaned in, my ear against his cracked tactical vest, and he repeated it. He was asking for his mother. Not the way a man asks for help, but the way a child does when they've wandered too far into the woods and realized the shadows have teeth. I didn't answer him, I couldn't. The weight of it all, the years, the faces of the men who hadn't made it to this patch of sand, the letters that would never be sent, it coalesced into a single, crushing truth. I was the one who had to carry it. I was the witness. I looked at the dark silhouette of the mountains and felt a strange, cold clarity. The war wasn't a hero's journey. It was a factory. It took young, loud-mouthed kids from Ohio and Nebraska and Florida, and it burned them down until they were just ash and duty and quiet, agonizing regret. I sat there in the cooling desert night, my hand on Henderson's arm, and I finally understood why nobody ever talked about it. You don't tell the truth because the truth doesn't fit in a conversation. It doesn't fit in a kitchen back home or a backyard barbecue or a living room at 2 in the morning. It's too heavy for language. The extraction took hours. It was a blur of rotor wash and voices that sounded like they were coming from underwater. They loaded us into the bird, and I remember looking down at the desert floor as we climbed, the lights of the recovery team looking like fireflies in a graveyard. I didn't look back at the wreckage. I didn't look for Miller's tag. I just watched the horizon, waiting for the dark to swallow the place where we had spent our best years dying in slow motion. When the plane finally lifted off the tarmac, leaving that country behind for good, the silence in the cabin was so thick you could have carved it with a knife. I didn't sleep. I just watched the stars. I was coming home, but I knew, with the kind of certainty that only comes from deep, personal loss, that I was leaving behind the only version of myself that had ever felt whole. The homecoming is a haze of bright, artificial light and faces that look like masks. I remember the terminal at the airport, the way the floor felt like it was shifting beneath my boots, even though I was standing on solid American concrete. My mother was there. She reached for me, her arms trembling, and when she pulled me into a hug, I felt like a stranger. Her perfume smelled like a life I didn't recognize anymore, the scent of soap and laundry and safety. I wanted to tell her, I wanted to say everything, but I just buried my face in her shoulder and let the tears come, the soundless, ugly, shaking kind that you can't hide. She patted my back like I was still the boy who left, but I wasn't that boy. I was a collection of scars and iron and memories that would never stop burning. The first night in my own bed was the hardest. I lay there in the dark, the room so quiet it made my ears ring. The sheets were soft, the air was cool, and there was no threat. That was the problem. The total absence of danger was the most threatening thing I had ever experienced. I reached out to the floor, my hand instinctively searching for a rifle that wasn't there, my heart slamming against my ribs at every settling creak of the house. I stayed that way until dawn, watching the shadows crawl across the ceiling, waiting for an explosion that never came. The morning light hit the kitchen linoleum just like I had remembered it, but the light didn't feel like a homecoming. It felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. I sat at the table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of me, and watched my family move around the room. They were so fragile. That was the word that kept hitting me. Everything here was so incredibly, terrifyingly fragile. The months after were a long, jagged slide into a place I didn't know how to navigate. I got a job, I drove a car, I talked to people, but I was always hovering 3 feet above my own life. I'd be in the grocery store, staring at a wall of cereal, and the fluorescent hum of the lights would suddenly sound like a distant jet engine. And I'd be back in the desert, my knuckles white on the mounting, waiting for the ground to shift. I went to the VA, I sat in the beige chairs. I listened to men who looked like me try to explain the unexplainable to people who had never seen a map with those lines drawn on it. Some days it helped. Some days I'd walk out into the parking lot and just sit in my truck for an hour, staring at the dash, trying to remember what it felt like to not be carrying a bomb in my chest. I remember one night, about a year after I got back, I was at dinner. My sister was laughing at something, a bright, clear sound that filled the room, and I started to laugh too. It was a good joke, something stupid and light. Then mid-laugh, I stopped. I just stopped. I looked at the table, at the glasses and the plates and the people I loved, and the guilt hit me like a physical blow. Miller wasn't laughing. Henderson was staring at a wall in a room somewhere, his eyes vacant, and I was here, eating dinner and pretending that the world wasn't broken. I stood up and walked out of the house. I walked until my lungs burned, until I was miles away, standing under a streetlight, breathing in the cold, wet air of a town that didn't know the first thing about the desert. I didn't break. I didn't go to pieces. I just learned to live with the weight. I realized that the survival wasn't about getting back to who I was. It was about building something new on top of the ruins. I started small. I started with the hope that maybe one day I could wake up and not check the exits first. I started with the hope that the nightmares would lose their teeth, and every now and then they do. I look at the guys I served with, the ones who are still here, and we don't talk about the craters or the heat or the sound of the metal tearing. We talk about the stupid, mundane things, the way the base coffee tasted like battery acid, the way Miller used to try to sharpen his knife with a flat rock. We laugh. It's a quiet laugh, the kind that has the weight of everything we lost sitting right underneath it, but it's a start. I don't look for answers anymore. I don't look for the why or the reason. The world is just the way it is, and we're just the people who have to walk through it. I have a dog now, a big, quiet yellow lab that just sits by my feet when the static starts to get too loud in my head. He doesn't ask questions. He just leans his weight against my leg, and that simple, physical connection brings me back to the ground. That's enough for now. It has to be enough. I'm still standing and I'm still here, and the morning light still hits the kitchen floor every single day, and I've learned to take it for what it is, a gift bought with a currency I don't ever want to count again. Tonight the house is quiet. The window is cracked open, and I can hear the crickets, a steady, rhythmic pulse that doesn't sound like a radio or a roar or a threat. It's just the sound of the world being alive. I'm sitting in the dark the way I used to in the barracks, but I'm not waiting for an alarm. I'm just waiting for the day to break, for the cycle to turn, for the next moment to arrive. I've carried this for years, kept it in the dark, kept it tucked away behind a wall of silence, but tonight I feel like I can let it breathe. I don't need to be fixed, and I don't need to be understood. I just needed to say it, to let the words out into the air so they couldn't rattle around in my skull anymore. I look at my hands. They aren't shaking tonight. They're just hands. They've done things I can't undo, and they've held things I can't forget. But they're also the hands that pet this dog, and the hands that hold a cup of coffee, and the hands that have built a life out of the wreckage. I'm going to go to sleep now. And tomorrow I'll wake up and I'll walk into the kitchen and I'll pour a cup of coffee and I'll live the next day and the next one after that. It's a small, quiet, specific kind of hope, but it's real, and for the first time in a long, long time, it feels like enough. I think about that crater sometimes and the yellow name tag and the way the desert tried to swallow everything we were. But then I look at the trees outside my window, swaying in the wind, and I realize that the world didn't end. We just moved to a different part of it. I'm not the same person who left Ohio, and I'll never be him again, but I'm someone. I'm here, I'm standing. And when the sun comes up, I'll be ready for whatever it brings. That is all anyone can ever really ask for, I guess. You walk through the fire, you get burned, you heal the best you can, and then you keep walking until you run out of road. It's not a story, and it's not a lesson, and it's not even really a memory anymore. It's just the truth of where I am. I'm still here, and the world is still spinning, and that has to be the end of it.